Excuse me. Good morning, everybody. I am very glad to be with you here and starting off your program. It's my first visit to Arkansas, so it's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. A couple of things, as Zach mentioned in my introduction. I am a native of the Midwest, and most all of my career so far has been wandering around the northern plains states. My home state of South Dakota is going through the hot flashes of spring, warm days, snowstorms, warm days, snow flurries, and so we're dealing with that back home. But it's nice to be here with you and to talk about some of the things that are going on in Washington, D.C. And I had a very belated thought just as I was coming into the room this morning, hearing that your last trip was a snowstorm last spring. And in lieu of your flying out to us in Washington, D.C., I should have put up a picture of the cherry blossoms, which are in full bloom this week, and with it has come the tourists in Washington, D.C., and so their presence is definitely noticed as we have throngs of people walking on our sidewalks around town again, and lots of tour buses on the streets as people flock to the capital city to see one of the iconic emblems of our country around the tidal basin and elsewhere across town. But we are on congressional recess this week with Easter, and so I know that was one of the challenges for you all to make your usual spring fly into Washington. But I'm happy to be here with you. As Zach mentioned, my specialty at Farm Bureau is livestock issues. I handle everything related to livestock, dairy, poultry issues. If it has feathers or hooves, I'm working on it. And so with that in mind, I fully disclose I'm not the expert on everything I'm sharing with you today, but I'll do my very best to share with you the work of my colleagues and answer your questions. I've been in Zach's shoes before, and so you get to be a master of nothing and a dangerous conversationalist on all kinds of topics. So with that, you know, I've recently been going through, I just finished up a program back in my home state of South Dakota, the South Dakota Ag and Rural Leadership Program, and I know you have a state Ag and Rural Leadership Program here in Arkansas as well. But one thing that we talked about there as part of our experience is the power of three when we do presentations, and I'm not quite going to be able to bundle our discussion this morning in the concise and snappy fashion of the power of three. But I do have a plan to sort of focus our discussion on three areas this morning: legislative issues, regulatory topics, and then just the politics that's going on and impacting everything that Congress and our federal agencies are doing. But I do welcome questions. I think we can handle, we've got plenty of time, I think, so we can handle questions anytime. Just get my attention and we'll visit. I don't know, do you have a microphone you want to field for questions? Just, I guess, housekeeping? Okay, just so we know that, I'll allow for someone to get a microphone to you. So legislative issues, not an all-inclusive list, but some of the big topics I'm going to cover with you today. Labeling, WOTUS, trade, budget, and labor are what we're going to touch on real quick, and we can cover other things if you have questions, but we'll start with these. Of course, we had a big blow 2 weeks ago in our efforts to standardize a national labeling system for genetically modified food items. We had tremendous leadership from Chairman Roberts on the Senate Agriculture Committee. He was a great steward, leading the effort to get compromise, to consider alternative options, but met a lot of resistance in the Democratic leadership of the Senate, and so we had a failed vote to have a uniform national plan for labeling GMO food products. That does create a big challenge for food companies because they are facing a July 1 deadline in the state of Vermont to label all food which contains genetically engineered ingredients. And so, following the vote of the Senate, we have seen announcements by major food companies that they are moving ahead with national, countrywide product label changes for their products because they have no choice and no time left in order to comply with Vermont's deadline of July 1. And so that is concerning. We have a state of Vermont has 600,000 some citizens, and the law adopted by the state of Vermont now is setting a standard for the entire country, which is a challenge. There is still opportunity to remedy the situation or the lack of a national standard for labeling, but it's not going to come in time for the deadline of July 1. And so that is why we're seeing food companies like Campbell's, ConAgra Foods, and some others that have announced in the past week that they are going to go ahead and change all labels for products in all markets of the U.S. And that is a bit of a handicap for our efforts because of course, once you have this change begun, it is hard to come backwards and make a national standard. So certainly a frustration, but it comes down to economics. As you all know very well from the regulations that face your businesses, if it doesn't pencil out, it's not going to work. And so that definitely has driven the change decision by these food companies to go ahead with labeling. We had a very robust coalition that worked on this effort, the Coalition for a Safe, Affordable Food Supply. It encompassed a wide range of folks, obviously the farm organizations like Farm Bureau, our commodity organization friends, but also the Grocery Manufacturers Association and other groups that work with food industry and consumers that wanted to protect consumers from an increased food costs in the grocery store, and that definitely is going to happen consequently with this change. Waters of the United States is certainly a topic you've been hearing about for several years, that this has been going on, the challenge of the expansion and redefinition of what constitutes a water of the U.S. under the Clean Water Act. Under the new rule, EPA's authority has been vastly expanded, and that has been the result of definitions that are unclear and a lot of loopholes in the writing and interpretation of the new WOTUS rule. What it will mean for all of us in production agriculture is that there will be a lot of obstacles to making land use decisions. Ordinary practices could be subject to the oversight of the EPA under the Clean Water Act under this new guidance. This has been highly litigated. There were several cases that were filed with the court systems. Currently, we have one case in the 6th District Circuit Court where they're reviewing. The judge has issued a stay, but they are continuing to review the case for jurisdictional issues. And so we're hopeful that will be favorably reviewed to our side of the rule. But there certainly is other weight on this. The U.S. Government Accountability Office, the GAO, did review the tactics of the lobbying campaign that EPA used for promoting waters of the United States and found in their legal opinion that the EPA violated campaign law for an administrative agency. And so that layers into our concerns and our arguments for the court. But at the bottom line of all of this, and this is certainly a topic and question for you to visit with your congressional delegation today, we need Congress to take action. We cannot operate under a system where agencies write rules that go around federal law. Congress must take action to rein in the agency's rulemaking and dial their overreach back from the EPA. Trade is a very busy topic. We actually have a pretty full agenda for trade activities in the country right now. I know you've got Ambassador Vetter joining the program, and so you'll have much more detail from her and a great update on particulars that are happening. But we're very active in our conversation to support trade negotiations that are ongoing. TPP, TTIP, and Cuba top the list of major issues that are in the trade arena. But it is notable from a wide-scale economic point of view that we are seeing a decline or a decreasing outlook for trade exports of agricultural products from the U.S. this year. I have some numbers on the screen for you comparing the 2015 export figures to what the outlook for 2016 is. This is largely a function of the strength of the U.S. dollar that influences purchasing decisions of other countries. Particularly, we've had a great strengthening of our dollar against the euro, and so we've seen a marked decline of export value and purchases from some countries because they're shopping around for the best value for their purchases. So our outlook is going to look a little softer than the past several years just because of the strength of dollar currency. When it comes to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Farm Bureau did a report on the potential benefits and impact of this trade agreement. $5.3 billion increase in exports for farm goods was found in that study, and a $4.4 billion increase of farm income for American producers. So with that information, we have thrown our support completely behind the TPP agreement, which is in front of Congress for their review. Some of the top items that are included in that, there are beef tariff reductions. Japan has been a country that we've had some challenges with our protein products. The pork quota tariff is reformed. There's tariff rate quota for rice in the proposal. And dairy's been a big topic, also debated in the negotiations for TPP, especially when we've seen countries included like New Zealand, who has a very robust and built-out dairy support system. It was a priority for the U.S. to make sure that dairy terms were fair and equitable across countries. But we're very glad that this negotiated package will include science standards. We're fans of science. I don't need to explain that at all. And so we appreciate that that's included in this package. There will be protections for biotech traits. And in a contrast to our negotiations with the European Union, common food names are included as terms. So I'll contrast that a little bit more in my discussion of TTIP. But it's certainly being bandied around as part of the election rhetoric. You've heard a lot of presidential candidates talking about their opposition. Most of them are opposed for an array of reasons across the spectrum and party lines of why they oppose it, but it's certainly held up with union politics and conservative review authority and other arguments. So not going to get a vote before the election, but there's definitely as a priority of this Obama administration, there is a lot of pressure and dialogue to members of Congress to take this up and vote on it, but under the timing, it's not likely that we'll see a vote before election. TTIP they've been sharing some very ambitious goals, saying that they want to have TTIP negotiated and penciled out by the end of 2016. Might be a good question for Darcy Vetter this afternoon, if that's really possible. A lot of skepticism on that front. It's just a very large trade bloc with the EU, and we have some pretty deep-bedded differences of opinion on a few topics. We've had a lot of trouble with European countries as we've tried to negotiate terms and approval for some of our sanitary processes in this country related to beef, poultry, and pork. GMO approval has been a very sticky issue as there have been a splintering of positions of European countries about approving and allowing the use of genetically modified crops to be grown in their countries. There are no bans on food products, but they have a kind of a range of policies by country on the approval and allowance for GM crops to be grown in the country. Tariff reductions are included, of course, but one of the other really sticky topics is the issue of what's called geographic indicators. And geographic indicators are very important to European countries because it is an emblem of traditional or historic food production practices. So a great couple of examples would be champagne. Champagne is defined as a sparkling wine product from the Champagne region of France. Champagne should not be called champagne anywhere else in the world, according to the French. And so we have debates on champagne versus sparkling wine. And so those common name disputes really use up a lot of oxygen as they try to negotiate, whether it's feta cheese or Parma ham or insert that product, usually based on a geographic or provincial region of Europe. But that really has been a difficult element of negotiation with the European Union. And of course, Cuba has been a very exciting and ever-moving and evolving issue as the U.S. has restored some diplomatic relations with the country. We've reopened our embassy there. Just last week, the president had a delegation of American businesses and congressional members join him on a brief trip to Cuba. But when you look at a map, Cuba's awfully close, and so it makes sense that we would want to move our American agricultural and other goods to that country. But in fact, they're not a big potential market in value for us, comparatively to some of those numbers that we were looking at for all agricultural products. Last year we exported $150 million worth of goods to the country. And so there is potential indeed, but there's still a lot of challenges to getting that market open to accepting American products. Congress will still need to lift the overall embargo on business and trade with Cuba. So much work ahead there, but there are liberalizing changes that affect tourism and education and some other things that are being developed. The budget really has been an active topic around the Hill, but it's very fluid, as you would imagine, with the president's budget, a very conservative conversation on budget in the House. The House Budget Committee has passed a resolution capping the fiscal year 17 budget at the same level as the Budget Control Act of 2015. That proposal does call for $30 billion of mandatory savings, and with that they task 5 committees to produce those $30 billion in savings for the year. Agriculture is one of the committees. If the House proposal would move forward and be considered with a joint resolution with the Senate, they also call for reconciliation measures, which would mean additional law changes and programmatic reforms would be called for in the package to yield additional savings of $10 billion over 10 years. Again, only in the case of a joint budget resolution being worked out with the Senate. Their plan also does call for a constitutional amendment to require a balanced budget. While the Budget Committee is busy debating, the Appropriations Committee is also working on discretionary spending plans. Both House and Senate committees are active on that front. They are working from the 2015 Budget Control Act numbers to work on those 12 appropes bills. But the politics continue there, of course, on very partisan lines. The Democrats will oppose any lowering of the budget cap on discretionary funds, and there are still quite a few zealous budget hawks that are looking for more programs to cut. We get concerned in agriculture, of course, having just done our work on reforming the expenditures of our farm bill, and this conversation brings up reform to our commodity program and crop insurance program as an example. There's attention always comes back to those programs and what the outlays are for farm programs on commodities. Labor and immigration really has been put on a back burner in terms of legislative energy and activity. And of course, that really is compelled by the election cycle. Immigration reform, meets a lot of contention as we have candidates visiting with their constituents and looking for those votes. But it's effectively stalled for the remainder of this Congress. But stakeholders from the issue are still working to educate members on the Hill, work with their staff to make sure they understand the really complex and substantive challenges that are in our current immigration laws and what reforms are needed to make this a workable process for American industry. They are working on, the coalitions for immigration are working on some minor tweaks that they can do as writers through the appropriations process, but those are mostly procedural in nature and not necessarily reform driven. So that's certainly an issue that we hope will be somewhere on a priority agenda for the next Congress, but we'll just see how that turns out after the election. So we're going to move on to the second area, regulatory actions. Of course, this is a space where we spend a lot of energy and effort to influence the guidance and the rules of engagement that agencies write to implement law. A couple of top line items I'm going to focus on with you all today from especially FDA and USDA, but then we're going to talk a little bit about Farm Bureau's priority strategically to reform the regulatory process. Food and Drug Administration, of course, one of our big issues from that agency has been the implementation of the Food Safety Modernization Act, a big suite of rules issued, everything from the manufacturer of animal feed to produce and so many pieces in between. But all of the rules have been issued by the agency now, and stakeholders are working to do a lot of education. How do we inform impacted businesses and producers about how this rule is going to affect their operation? We are working with other stakeholder groups across the country to hopefully, and our State Farm Bureau partners, to organize some roadshow programs, if you will, that will do education, on-farm training for business owners and employees, and hopefully do some pre-assessments that will smooth the transition to compliance with the new FSMA guidance. And that is part of one of our strategic priorities for the coming year as well. A topic from my world, with livestock issues, the Veterinary Feed Directive is a pretty notable and impactful change for the livestock industry regarding antibiotic use. The FDA is ending production use of antimicrobials, that being feed efficiency and growth promotion, and feed uses of medically important antibiotics, which means those classes of antibiotics that are used in human health. Those will be allowed for therapeutic use, but only with the guidance of a veterinarian. Water-soluble antibiotics will become prescription only, and you'll be working to get a veterinary feed directive order for any of those antibiotics that you want to deliver by feed to livestock. An important clarification is this rule change is not impacting injectable antibiotics or anything that you would give as an oral bolus product. There are other classes of some products that the FDA classifies as antimicrobials that are not used in human health, and one very common example of that is ionophores. There are no ionophores used in human medicine, and they are not part of this rule change. But we have through January 1st, 2017 to work on the compliance with this and full implementation. So if you are a livestock producer and you do use any of these products, my recommendation is to begin that conversation with your veterinarian to understand how your access to these products is going to change. You're going to have to do some planning to know when you anticipate that those drug products will be needed. But this is all part of our effort to engage and show meaningful progress from animal agriculture in the issue and challenge, very real challenge of antimicrobial resistance. So that's a big change for our livestock sector. I know that this is excuse me, an important issue here in Arkansas. We've all had our fingers crossed this winter, and as we begin the spring season, high-path avian influenza. We haven't had any outbreaks since last. We had one little backyard flock, I think it was, found back in January, but we haven't had any breaks yet this spring. But one concern that folks from industry had and USDA responded to with an interim rule is to provide a clear and explicit method to divide indemnity payments between owners of birds and contract growers that are caring for those birds. And so they have issued a rule for that, which we support. The rule also made some clarifications for indemnification of eggs that are destroyed in the response of an outbreak. And it does call for producers and for bird owners and contractors to comply with a biosecurity plan, which we also are supportive of. Comments are due April 11th, and American Farm Bureau will be submitting comments to that rule. We did have a few questions on that. It does not change the calculation value, and I know that has been a concern for some, but we do have the benefit of a very clear split process for the indemnity, which is a good assurance in that process. You know, the Clean Water Act, I've mentioned a few things. There are always regulatory issues under the Clean Water Act in the jurisdiction of the Environmental Protection Agency. Certainly with the implementation of WOTUS, There's a lot of questions, and we anticipate a lot of challenges on the countryside dealing with compliance there. Chesapeake Bay, we continue to watch the progress as EPA, works towards any rulemaking in that region, because it would be a precedent for the country's largest watershed, which is the Mississippi River. So very attentive on EPA's work, but really that has compelled a big effort at American Farm Bureau this year on regulatory reform. We are partnering with a lot of our friends in agriculture and other regulated industries. It's not just agriculture, it's transportation industries, it's some of the natural resource groups also are engaged in this effort with us to reform federal rulemaking processes. We all need a fair, reasonable, and predictable regulatory system. We can't have the rules changing at will with administrations or between agencies. We oppose further expansion of the Clean Water Act. Endangered species reform has become a very big concern as we see, when the Endangered Species Act was created in the early 70s, there were, I think it was 90 or 100 species included on that list. Today we have over 1,600 species under the Act, and some 100 additional species being considered for protection. So we're concerned that Act is being used as in a way not intended by activists that want to impede and prohibit use of natural resources. So that's one of our concern areas, and generally more transparency is needed in the process. A few very specific examples of efforts we are undertaking with our coalitions to reform the Administrative Procedures Act, Equal Access to Justice Act. That would be a case where the government would be called to reimburse costs to petitioners that take up a case and deal with a regulatory issue and lose. We've had some issues with that related to some Bureau of Land Management cases out in the West, and it's a concern that producers and landowners are being disadvantaged in contrast to activist organizations. But really, one of our fundamental principles is that more science is needed. Agencies must be responsible for that content to prove out and share the economic analysis that they do to justify these burdensome rulemakings. And so we're going to get down now to the political distractions. And I know you've got some additional speakers on the program today that might put some more context around the politics, but certainly as we just look at our agenda as an agriculture organization, there's some things that we're concerned about, big picture related to the political cycle that we are in. Of course, the election itself will be a game changer on the dynamics of our executive branch. Who will be our next president, and what will the agenda be with that new administration? Of real concern is how that presidential vote is going to influence the down ballots. We have a Senate, a Republican-controlled Senate, and a House-controlled Senate. It would not be unforeseeable to see a Senate flip. And certainly I defer to the really wonky political pundits on that to make their forecasts for what seats are most at risk. But there is an influence of the down ballot votes when we have a top presidential vote cast. And certainly hinged very close to that is the Supreme Court. With the death of Justice Scalia, We have a nominee. President Obama has put forth his candidate, Judge Merrick Garland, who is considered to be a moderate liberal in the case of the court. But there's a lot of resistance in the Senate. Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Senator Grassley from Iowa, has very plainly said he does not want to take up a approval of a new Supreme Court judge. Getting a lot of pressure. The senator was home in Iowa yesterday and had a lot of protests at some of his town hall meetings, insisting that the Senate take action and to appoint a new Supreme Court justice. The Republican Senate says they want to wait until a new administration, that the new president, being as close as we are to an election and a new administration, that should be a decision deferred to a new president. But that does present pros and cons, depending on the outcome of election. So pivotal election in the respect of the future of the Supreme Court. Some folks estimate that there could be 3, 4, possibly 5 retirements and deaths out of the current Supreme Court bench during the conceivable terms of the next presidency. So the future of our highest court definitely is a large looming issue in Washington and the election cycle politics today. And of course, after the election, we have a lame duck session. Got a couple of weeks when Congress comes back to town, where you might say anything could happen in a lame duck session. Hard to tell exactly what that agenda will be, but some of the things that you might expect to be considered would be some of the trade negotiation decisions on TPP. Certainly the Supreme Court appointment could be on that list of business. But again, it's a wait and see kind of issue for us. All hinging on that early November vote. So with that, I'm going to end. I know we've got a little time for some questions. Anything I didn't cover or clarity that might be useful for you today. Certainly none of these topics are new to this audience. We seem to be perpetually working on some of these issues, but because they're really foundational challenges for us. So trade is always on our agenda. Regulatory reform is always there. But I'd be glad to answer any questions you have, and welcome Zach up certainly if he has any perspectives from Arkansas or additional details to share about the Arkansas delegation.
Thank you very much.
Trudy, my name is Gene Farr, and my question concerns your first topic, which was GMO labeling. And I'm wondering where the line is drawn. A lot of our poultry and livestock are fed GMO crops, which I have nothing against GMO crops because I think they cut down on pesticide residues that the country is, eating in their food. But where is the line drawn for like beef cattle or poultry that eat GMO crops?
Very good question, and that came through in some of the early negotiations actually back when the House was working on their legislation, the SAFE Act. There was a small provision in one of the drafts that would have included provisions for labeling feed fed to animals. In the final bill, I believe that was scrubbed out. So that was not included in any of the preceding language. So really, the GMO labeling bill was focused on processed foods or whole ingredients. So feed for livestock did not come through the filter on labeling criteria. Yep.
Trudy, you mentioned avian influenza and they're working on a program. Can you expound on that a little bit more as to what they're doing?
So in brief, the proposed rule from the USDA on the indemnity split would take the value of birds grown and apportion it by day of contract. So there would be and it would be unique to the individual contract of the grower and the bird owner. So it would not be a standard rate, but it would be based upon the actual contract terms of that bird owner and contract grower. So basically, for easy math, if the indemnity of the bird value is $100,000, they would divide that by the length of the contract for growing those birds. And if the birds are diagnosed with AI at day 10, it would be a multiplier of 10 days of cost, split back to the grower. So our concern, however, is if there is an outbreak early in that production cycle at the farm, as a contract grower, you have a lot of upfront costs invested in that turn of birds that have come through. Bedding, utilities, labor to set up and prepare for receiving those birds. And so one of the points we have offered and will be making in our comments is that may be a provision that needs some further review because of the upfront costs of a contract grower in that arrangement. So again, they will account for whatever performance bonuses or productivity matrix that you would have with your integrator, and that would be the calculation and value used.
How quick could they implement this?
So they are planning, so they issued the rule 30 days or so ago, and they are taking comments through April 11th, and the rule will take effect, I think they have it taking in effect immediately. But they'll receive comments and feedback, for any further improvements or enhancements that are needed.
Trudy, my name's Bruce Jackson. What I was wanted to ask about, at EPA, when they decided that was a misuse of funds, what happened to those people that made that decision to use that money, or did anything happen to them?
Excellent question. Certainly we would be eager to hear about, of course, disciplinary actions for those folks. I can't quantify for you exactly what has happened within the agency. I would have to defer that question to one of my colleagues.
Trudy, on your discussion on trade agreements and the TTIP agreement, do you think, how big of an impact is it going to be on us in negotiations with the EU with their GIs or geographic indicators, since they've just gotten a bilateral trade agreement not long ago with Canada, which allowed them, I think it's at least 24 GIs. So where's that going to put us in negotiations with the EU on this TTIP agreement?
That that does present a challenge for us because we have one of our biggest trading partners that has met them at their place of negotiation on the GI issue. So, and particularly as you turn the other direction and look at the terms of our negotiations on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Canada is an important partner in that as well. So it's not helpful, is probably the short answer. I think Ambassador Vetter probably would be, I'd be very interested to hear how she explains that circumstance this afternoon.
Good morning, Trudy. Some questions about your USDA indemnity payments. There's been some questions in my area about the time that those indemnity payments would be based on versus the high mortality rate of birds. And I didn't know in their improvements going forward if there was any protocol to that, because I understand there's a sizable amount of time for testing, and then the mortality rate is so high by that time.
Very true. There was a lot of discontent, to put it mildly, perhaps, after the spring 15 outbreak, when we were seeing widespread, numerous outbreaks up in the Midwestern poultry states, and we weren't getting USDA folks out quickly enough to those farms because the indemnity program protocol is such that birds cannot be compensated for until infection is verified by USDA. And the reason for that is to incentivize early detection and reporting of outbreaks. And so, on one hand, USDA is not movable on that policy. However, their after-action review of the spring outbreak, they have released their modified emergency response plans where they have committed to a much more robust and timely process to get confirmations done. They've pulled out a couple of the bureaucratic procedural steps in it to expedite those testing confirmations. So they're not going to skip that part of or change the need for confirmation, but they have heartily committed and made plans to expedite the process.
Yep. Right.
Okay.